I'm really pleased to have Professor Diane Coyle. She's the Bennett Professor of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge. She is also the director of the Bennett School of Public Policy. And I'm really thrilled because she's doing what we all social scientists care about. She's looking at progress and what makes societies better. And she's going to be talking about AI and measures of PVP and also very interesting stuff. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I've been a bit nervous because I'm an economist by background. I'm in a public policy school, but social policy isn't my area. So I'm trying to flex this a little bit towards what I hope are some of your interests. I am going to be talking about, partly going to be talking about what's in this recent book, The Measure of Progress, and but also about some thinking that I'm doing right now about what might we want to start to measure, to think about and monitor the effects that AI is having on the economy. And the book has a sort of meta message about the importance of measurement. Economic data is used by governments and businesses to make decisions, so the way that we construct that picture of the economy has implications for the economy and for people's lives. And people often think that the kinds of statistics that we use are natural objects. They've been in use for 70 years or so. We've got very used to GDP growth as the metric, although there's a huge debate about whether it's a sufficient metric. And people often say to me, well, we should stick with GDP because that's a hard number. And once you start looking into how it's constructed, it's anything but. Lots of value judgments go into it. Its definition changes over time. And so the data is a social construct, and it's constructed through a social process and a community of statisticians. And as AI uses ever more data, I think it becomes more important to think about all of the data feeds that are going into decision making in private businesses and public sector organisations and government alike. So part of the argument of the book is that the existing framework for economic measurement is a poor fit to how the economy has changed. And it's really a game of two halves. And I'm going to talk quite a lot about the digital part of it because that's what I'm mostly focused on at the moment. But there is also a part about, well, what would a different framework for thinking about the economy look like and how might we construct that? And we can always get onto that. But I wanted to start out by thinking about the digital aspect, measuring the digital economy. 10 years ago, Sir Charles Bean published a big report of economic statistics with a long chapter about the gaps in understanding the way that digital technology is changing the economy. Pretty much nothing has changed since then. There are still huge gaps in understanding. So the examples listed here, the structure of production, factorless goods production, companies like Apple and Nike, but also many more, who do not manufacture the products that they sell. That's all contracted out, often overseas. Relatedly, there are complicated global supply chain networks that have developed since the 1980s. We don't have a good picture of where they are. People now understand that most advanced computer chips are made in Taiwan, but there are all kinds of other bottlenecks in these supply chains that are completely unknown. Some of them took us by surprise during the pandemic as well. Servitization, the process whereby manufacturing companies often make most of their revenues and profits from selling services around the manufactured products. Rolls-Royce is a well-known example. They do make fantastic aero engines. They make more money from selling the services and monitoring those engines in use than they do from selling the engines in the first place. I was reading recently about a satellite company in Edinburgh or Glasgow that makes miniature satellites. They're quite popular, but they're selling many more data services using the information that people can get from the satellites than they are actually the satellites themselves. So that's quite common too. So all of these changes in structure. Digital platforms are invisible really in the statistics because we still think about the conventional linear relationships in production. All the free stuff that gets provided. We don't know how to measure that in the existing framework. The free services that we all use on our phones, all the open innovation that's done, open source software that people create, videos that people put online for free to entertain you. So a growing unpaid economy, which economists don't really know how to think about, and statisticians certainly don't know how to put into the accounts in a consistent way. So that's invisible. And yet, if certain bits of open source software fell over or were not maintained, the whole internet would collapse, and with it, the whole modern economy. Data is something I'm very interested in looking at the moment, because there are lots of questions about, you can create a lot of value from data, but whose value is that? Is it the originators of the data? Is it the controllers of the data? Is it the users of the data? What are the legal and commercial frameworks that allow that value to be captured? But it also has a role in market power. A lot of the market power of big tech comes from the fact that they have a lot of data already. They can use that to generate more in a flywheel. And that's part of the market power, which they keep out new entrants in technical areas. And then price indices. The digital aspects raise a lot of questions about how we introduce new goods into price indices. Brackets, not very well. About how do we take account of quality change in products? Brackets, not very well. But also, how do we think about combining the many different products in the economy into a single price index? The theory of price indices, which is implemented in the statistics, assumes that all goods are substitute for each other. They're clearly not. And we are consuming bundles of handsets, data services, content services, data center services together in the kind of consumption that we're doing. So we need to think about bundles of goods and price indices. But anyway, you can't substitute having breakfast for watching a TikTok video. They're just not substitutes. And the construct of price indices doesn't allow for taking account of this, which we see reflected in debates about affordability, because if you're a low-income household, the fact that the price of data services has been plummeting isn't much comfort if you really can't afford your breakfast. And so a lot of known issues, which are getting worse with AI. I wanted to focus a bit on unpaid production, because I think it's very important for interpreting what's going on in people's lives, but also how do we think about the productivity measurements that we get from conventional statistics. So my example here on the images is how shopping has changed. And in the 50s and 60s, you would be a housewife not working, as in this image, and you'd go to the greengrocer and you say, I'd like half a pound of butter. It's behind the counter. They measure it for you. They chat to you, and you spend a long time doing a bit of shopping. Supermarkets come along, greatly increase the efficiency of shopping. You're doing the selecting yourself, but somebody is still doing, with the investment in the checkouts, still doing that for you, and somebody is standing at the end ready to put your shopping in a bag for you. Next phase of change, you collect the goods off the shelves yourself. The assistant scans for you, but you do the bagging yourself. So there's a paid labour gain for the supermarkets there. And then we have now these automatic checkouts. If you're my age, you hate and swear at all the time. They save you some time in queuing up, but you're doing that whole process yourself. So there's been a substitution of paid labour with capital and software and our unpaid labour. So how do we interpret the productivity of retailing in the light of that? There's been capital deepening that increases productivity, but there's also been this switch across the production boundary from paid labour to unpaid labour. It'll make the supermarkets look more productive. But actually, if you think about the time saving in that process of shopping, so there was time saving, somebody else did the work, and then there's less time saving for individuals because we're doing some of the work. So I think that's a really interesting illustration of how the technology shifts things that one doesn't necessarily notice across the production boundary out of the measured economy, but economically valuable activities are still going on. And now there are loads of these examples enabled by digital. Open source software, I mentioned, vast amount being created. There's a very interesting article by Jean Tirole and a co-author about the extent to which that's part of the gift economy. which is not something you'd necessarily expect an economist to be thinking about. Open innovation or user innovation, particularly in sporting goods and medical goods. This is people who see a need that isn't fulfilled by the market, so they develop a product, they put the blueprints online on the internet. You can make static limbs, for example, through additive printing, and all of this takes place outside the paid economy. At some point, some of those things become commercialized, and so snowboarding, I think, is one example which started as an individual innovation and then obviously became quite a large marketed product. Household production, the do-it-yourself digital. I wrote a paper about this in 2019, whereby we do banking online, travel agency online. So again, a lot of switches enabled by digital from things that you would have paid for in the high street to a travel agent or an assistant at bank, now being done by ourselves, with pros and cons. So more flexibility, less queuing time if you're waiting for somebody to serve you, but equally a substitution of unpaid for paid labour. And then we've got the debates I'm sure you know about data. We're all providing these free services, lots of our data. The companies make a lot of money out of it. One of the arguments made in a well-known article is that this should be considered as labour and remunerated. The catch with that, in my view, is that if you assign a value to your individual data, it's really small. And there are calculators online whereby you can do this. It's the collection, it's the collective of data that's valuable. And even if you paid for data as labour, the companies would still gather all of that value. So that goes to the debates about the effect of monitoring that's going on in the world. So people are creating economic value from monitoring the collected information about mobile phone data as you move around London. Is that labour? Should I get some of that value? So some very important unresolved debates there, I think. So all of these gaps, not only in the collection of statistics, we don't know how much data is used, a lot of this isn't held by private companies, but also the conceptual framework. How should we be thinking about this? Is this a good thing or not? What are the economic welfare consequences and the policy consequences for this? So this is one of the examples of the gaps that I think exist already, and AI is making it worse. I have one paper out trying to think about how would we know if AI is transforming the economy. And the answer is, at the moment, we probably wouldn't, not through statistics anyway. So there's a lot of value. I think it's a transformative technology. It's going to change the economy in many ways. It can improve the quality of services. It will change, without doubt, change the kind of work that we do and the way that we work. There'll be some job losses, some job gains. It will speed some things up. It will enable new things to happen. There'll be new business models. There'll be AI agents coming along. It's absolutely invisible in the data. This is partly because the data is not collected and is held by private companies. But when I talk to people at the AI companies, I would say to them, the conversation we're having publicly about AI is either job apocalypse, it's going to destroy all jobs, or it's psycho chatbots causing your teenage children to kill themselves. Only you have the data for us to uncover whether there are any positive economic stories emerging from this technology. I hope eventually that they will start to be much more open, starting a little bit about what people are doing with their data. But in official statistics, we've got no idea about what's going on. The technology itself is changing dramatically. So the chart on the right comes from a well-known study by Meta showing the length of time for which you can leave an AI to get on with the task that you set it by itself. So it goes from January 2020 to mid-2025, and the time horizon on the vertical axis has gone from GPT-2 in 2020, you could leave it to run by itself for less than 4 seconds, and by now it's got up to about 3.5 hours, where you can leave an AI to do a task autonomously. And this has become, in the industry, the favoured metric for progress, for the progress that's going on. And so far, that progress has been absolutely astonishing. I visit Stanford a couple of times a year to talk to people doing this kind of work. And every time in the past 3 years that I've been, they have been surprised at how quickly the technology has advanced. So I think those gains are real. And it's been because of what people call scaling laws. You throw more data, more compute, more bigger models, more parameters. And as you scale up each of those, and each of them is a bottleneck, but as you scale each of them up, the gains, the technical gains have been extraordinary. And they're continuing because the companies are competing quite intensely among themselves. There is, of course, a lot of hype. There's almost certainly a financial bubble because there's so much round tripping going on financially among the companies. Tesla, why did Tesla share price go up this morning? Simply extraordinary. But there are obviously economic and social bottlenecks. Last September, I was at an event that combined AI engineers and economists. And the AI engineers said, we're going to have superintelligence by 2027. It can do everything, it can solve all the problems. And you would say, how will it solve the problems? Well, it could be super intelligent. So there's kind of mysticism. I don't know whether we'll get super intelligent AI next year. And surprisingly, the economists, who are not the most socially aware people, were the ones saying, there are some bottlenecks. It might be a little bit slower before your super intelligent AI has impacts. So I don't know how long it will take. I think there will be some impacts. And the one we're all talking about is the job apocalypse. And so here are just some recent examples. There's one in the paper every day. Head of the IMF, 60% of jobs in advanced economies will be affected. Entry-level roles wiped out. CEOs at Davos sounding the alarm. CEO of Palantir, or hiss and boo. AI will reshape jobs as tech firms shift. Human AI collaboration becomes the norm. And so this is really why we care, because this is affecting a fundamental human activity and source of livelihoods for everybody. We want to know, we want to monitor what's going on with people's jobs. What are the jobs? What skills are needed? What retraining is needed? How are people getting an income? What will happen to the distribution of income? Will it all go to Alex Karp, or will he share it with some of us? And even this morning, a government minister saying, well, of course we need universal basic income because AI is going to destroy jobs. We might tax some tech firms, which I thought was politically quite brave because there's very little of that talk going on. And this is why we care. It's going to reshape our lives. And hopefully it will reshape our lives in the domestic, the household production environment, for the better as well. But there's obviously going to be a considerable upheaval. I think it will be slow. And I'll just spend a couple of slides talking about why I think it will be slow. But I do also think we want to be prepared, both in policy terms, for that kind of restructuring, but also just to know and have some data about what's happening. So why will it be slow? Well, first of all, uptake is still pretty low. These are figures from UK survey of companies who are asked directly, are you using AI? Are you planning to use AI? It doesn't specify what they use it for, but the maximum measure based on, because it's tilted towards large companies, firms accounting for 14% of the revenue of the UK economy say they are using AI. That's not really very large, given that it's already had a couple of years and there are many services that you can access. AI use across countries correlates with GDP per capita, which isn't surprising. It has a sectoral bias, so the tech sector uses it most, again, not very surprising. People are asked if they're using AI, but we don't know what they're using it for or what kinds of products. The surveys for that don't exist. And we don't know what kinds of complementary investments and organisational change are needed. One of the lessons of the previous digital boom was that there's a lot of organisational change and investment needed. So if you think about the decision that firms are making, God, this is much too small to read, isn't it? what are the costs that they have to think about in investing in a new technology? So the left-hand cluster here is the technology costs, divided into fixed and variable. So the fixed will be things like you've got to do some new data architecture, which is a one-off cost, or you've got to pay for licenses for your software. The variable costs like maintaining the data, paying for cloud computing and so on. So there's a bunch of technical costs. And then a bunch of organizational costs as well. Again, some of those will be one time. How do you restructure the organization? You pay McKinsey to do your business process reengineering. You've got to retrain your workers, perhaps, your existing workers. You might have some costs in existing technology, so you have a write-down in your balance sheet of some prior technology. And then also their ongoing costs as well, in training and data maintenance and management, including security, which is a data cost not often factored in. So it is costly. And what's happening in organizations is that you might be completely sold on using an AI technology, and you go to your finance director and you say, we will have to re-engineer the process, we will have to get all of the other departments to change how they do things so that the benefits that my department produces can have spillovers elsewhere, and we don't know what it's going to do for our revenues. We can do things faster, we can have better products, but we're not actually sure what the outcome will be for the firm. And the finance director will say, please go away. Restructuring is very costly anyway. So the chart on the right here shows the costs of restructuring just in terms of labour costs for European countries, Denmark and Switzerland in the middle, and the US on the right. And this is how many months' salaries does it cost to lay off an existing labour force and hire a labour force with different skills. So you can see that there's a European disadvantage anyway in terms of those labour costs. And then there are a whole bunch of other reasons external to the firm about why change might be slow. One is that a lot of the profits are being gathered by superstar firms, so they can see great reasons for using this technology. If you are in any other kind of company, not a superstar company, margins are tight, business is slow at the moment, so there's not going to be very much investment. There's an argument about the inherent complexity of adopting AI, because its potential is to change end-to-end workflows. You might be relatively easily able to use AI to change a task that you do, but changing tasks across the whole organization and linking those up is much more complicated. And so Jim Besson at Boston University Law School has a wonderful book about why the inherent complexity of companies has increased over time as they become more based on intangibles and software. Competitive global production networks refers to the fact that you're not simply talking about change in an organization, but potentially across a whole global supply chain. The standout productivity gains in the 1990s were attributed to Walmart, to one American company. But what it did was ditch all of its existing logistics, implement new logistics technology, and switch to a completely global supply chain. Huge, huge investment, could only be done by a company managed in the way it is by long-term owners, but it accounted for something like 15% of US productivity in the 1990s. So an extraordinary figure. That's a guess, that figure, but it's of that order. Cost of restructuring, I just mentioned, and then all of the questions about the business environment in which we're operating. So let me just pick out infrastructure. I live in West London. We can no longer build any housing in West London because all of the electricity is going to data centres. If places make the opposite decision, they can't have data centres. So there are real infrastructure constraints and infrastructure investment needs on a large scale. If you think about the scale of the spending that's going on data centres at the moment, it is enormous. A lot of it's happening in the US. To the extent it's happening elsewhere, it's other OECD economies. to bring AI to Kenya or India, the scale of investment needed there is absolutely, in infrastructure alone, is absolutely enormous. So that's the environment. So I talked about costs inside the firm. That's the external environment. Now I want to go back to process changes. I think I've got my slides in a slightly illogical order here, but we'll go with it. When you're thinking about introducing a new general purpose technology, be it electricity or AI, you are talking about changing processes in production. So here's an assembly line. I'm not quite sure what they're making. I took a picture off the internet. But it is about a different model of production that involves changing working practices, changing the tasks involved in a job, and changing building layouts, factory layouts, and so on. So for that to happen and to think about the right kind of policy environment for those changes, you do need to have enough dynamism in the market that new business models can get in. That goes back to the market power question. Can new entrants get in? Can they successfully implement different kinds of business models in the way that the platform models managed to enter into markets in the late 1990s and early 2000s? Is there enough flexibility in labour markets, internal and external, for people to change the kind of jobs that they do? I showed you a slide or so back, the low cost of restructuring in Scandinavian economies and Switzerland. The Danish flexicurity model is often cited as one way to enable that kind of flexibility in a socially constructive way that speeds up the process of organisational change. Accountability mechanisms are an issue in many organisations. If it goes wrong, who's to blame? Very important in public sector organisations. So all of the government hype about using AI to improve public services, I'm really sceptical that will happen, because for it to happen, those organisations would have to accept that different people are taking decisions in different ways, using the affordances of the technology that become available to them. Unless you change the decision process and the accountability process, then the fact that technology enables something else to happen is completely irrelevant. So organisational change is key in my view, and it's one area where I'm trying to do more work now. The paper at the bottom I thought was really interesting because it's an experiment. No, it's not an experiment. Is it an experiment? No, it's a difference in difference approach. And they use a massive data from a range of companies to identify quite large individual productivity gains from using AI, but no impact on organisational outcomes. And this to me speaks quite directly to this point that you can do what you do faster or better, but unless the whole organisation changes, there's going to be no firm level change and no macroeconomic change. So understanding what happens inside organisations becomes key. So we have been doing some qualitative work, talking to companies. It's been a range of companies across different sectors like architecture, auto design, special effects, urban planning, to understand why those who are using the Unreal Games engine in 3D visualization are doing so, what do they get out of it, and why do the rest of their organizations not do the same thing. And we've also done interviews with chief technology officers in larger companies to ask about the decision process about investing in AI technologies. So this is not, there's some working papers out, but not yet published. And these are notably organizational barriers. So companies often think about, they've got a set of KPIs, they want to know what's the impact going to be on their KPIs. So it's quite short term, it's stuff that's easy to quantify. Cost saving in particular. And so just as when you're talking to the Treasury, they never believe in spend to save initiatives, finance directors are just the same. If you go to them and say, as a matter of our position in the market or doing better for our customers, we need to invest in this technology, the answer will be, well, what cost savings do we make short term? So AI tends to be seen for incremental improvements. Organizations have silos. We talked to somebody in a car manufacturing company who was using the gains engine to redesign the interface inside the car in a matter of hours, if that, and test different layouts and different kinds of designs for all of the bits and pieces you get in the dashboard. And he would take this to the mechanical engineers who do construction and say, that's very interesting, go away, we'll just prototype something in the old way and it will cost £10,000, but they weren't interested. They had no incentive to be interested in the fact that he could do his stuff so much faster. So silos, boards don't understand very much, politicians and senior civil servants don't understand very much of this either. There's change management, there's decision making. We did one interview with somebody in a big company who said, if we want to change anything non-trivial, there are 40 people on the phone call to agree whether this can go ahead or not. And then often you would have to run systems in parallel, things go wrong if you don't do that. And there are some costs. So people might have equipment that's working perfectly well. If there's no market pressure for them to change, they're not going to change. So a lot of organizational barriers. So as I said, I'm still doing some work in this area, and I had a key moment last July, when I attended World Intellectual Property Organization, did my little spiel about data, and then this chap stood up. He was the head of strategy at Dell at the time, and these are some of the quotes. Dell's supply chain is its key intangible asset. Last year, using AI, Dell's revenue rose and operating expenditure fell for the first time ever, because previously you'd always had to spend a bit more to earn more revenue. Organizational capabilities are a sustained competitive advantage. AI means there's a challenge in measuring these capabilities. And I sat up and I thought, I like challenges about measuring things, so let me think about measuring things. And then this is a slightly logical order, I'm afraid. But this goes to this point about process innovation. We think about the gadgets, we might think about the data centers, but the key drivers of productivity through history have been process changes. American system of manufacturers, producing interchangeable parts, allowing things to be repaired much more quickly, standardizing engineering knowledge, a great step forward in the early 19th century. Just-in-time manufacturing, another example. So we'd had the introduction of assembly lines, and then we went to the post-Fordist model of just-in-time production. So the tasks involved in building a car are the same, whether you do it on an assembly line or in a just-in-time mode with teams building complete vehicles. So the tasks are the same, but the job composition is different. And the throughput of materials is different, and the time taken, as the name suggests, is different. So that enabled a huge decline in holding of inventories, enormous cost savings for businesses, and in sectors like car manufacturing, big driver of productivity gains in the 1990s. Production networks in the late 20th century, platforms. So who knows what kind of process changes we will get from AI? Will it be, agentic something? I don't know what it will be. But what I want to think about, and I'm hoping to get some ideas from all of you today, is how do we think about firms' organizational capital and intangible assets to understand, are they going to be able to use AI? What will it do for them? And what will the broader consequences be? Can we create some visibility in the economic statistics? So I've got this table. Some of you will know that there is a widely accepted framework for categorizing intangibles that already exists in the economics literature, dating back to 2005 by Carl Corrado, Chuck Holton and Dan Sickle. It's been slowly implemented into the GDP statistics. And so the items in italics in this table are all the ones that are included in GDP. But they have a completely different categorization. So in a sense, what I've done is recategorize the components of intangibles that we think about to divide those broadly into the things that are codified, they can be written down, and they can be sold. There are markets for them. So that's things like artistic, entertainment, and literary originals, which are protected by copyright as well as technically, some kinds of standardized software, some types of data, and so on. So they can be sold, but a lot of the value that they have in the market is created by the fact that there's monopoly power associated. They are protected legally, or they're protected technically, or both. And that means that there may well be market prices for them. It also means that because they're codified, they may be substituted by AI relatively easily. And it may be that AI enhances the value of some of these and dramatically reduces the value of some of these. So if you've got copyrighted artistic materials now, you're very worried about the impact of AI on that value that you've created and that you hold in your copyright. But for some of the others, like platform technology or algorithms, which are not copyrighted, they're protected by trade secrets, but they may have their value limited by AI because it will make them operate more efficiently. And then the really interesting category to me is this, what I called organizational capital. I'm going to have to change the name because one of my colleagues who's an organizational scholar says it's already used to mean something different. But live with it for now. Only one of these is currently included in official statistics, and that's own account R&D. There's a whole R&D component to intangible capital. But if it's own account, that probably says that you're doing something highly technical, you've got real specialist staff involved in doing that, so it's life sciences or it's technology and so on. That I think requires detailed organizational tacit knowledge. And that's the point of all of these categories. They all require contextually specific knowledge, experience, expertise, detailed knowledge, very hard to value, and certainly can't solve. You know, it's part and parcel of what defines the firm. So my current thinking is that these kinds of categories help answer Vivek Mahendra's question about what defines the organizational moat any company has, and that can potentially be protected. What's AI going to do here? Well, again, I think it could go in two ways. It could dramatically increase the value of the things that can't be codified because they become relatively scarce, standard economic mechanism. Or it could actually start to take some of the tacit knowledge and codify it. And so one of the potential capacities of AI, generative AI, is to observe a lot of data about things that are going on and turn that into codified knowledge. I don't know which way that will go, but I think that makes these kinds of categories really interesting to think about. What's less clear is how you would actually measure these, and that's the area I'm thinking about at the moment. There are some surveys, there might be some data from AI companies that we can use. There's a literature about state capacity that might be helpful in thinking about management capacity. So that I think is an open question and something I want to think about now. I don't know how I'm doing for time. We'll have 10 more minutes. Okay, that's fine. So just got a few more. So one of the metrics that I do think is very interesting, and I've hinted at it already, is how do we use time? Just thinking about what's AI going to do in the labour market, thinking about the literature talks in terms of tasks. What tasks are involved in a job? How will they be rebundled as AI starts to affect the workforce? And a lot of the assessment of how many jobs are going to be affected uses this exposure metric. To what extent can the tasks involved in a particular job or occupation be automated using AI? And you get quite a wide range of estimates, but they're scary large estimates in some cases. I think exposure by itself is not a good metric because the fact that it could be automated doesn't mean that it will be automated. The recent paper by David Alter and Neil Thompson says think about expertise instead. the pattern tends to be that generic jobs are not automated, and so we still have people cleaning houses and helping keep police crossings and so on. It's things that are somewhat expert and somewhat routine that tend to get automated, so they use expertise as the index of which kinds of jobs are going to be automated in future. If AI does free people from really boring cognitive jobs, that's probably a good thing. It's the way that previous technologies have released people from really boring routine jobs in the past. I grew up in the Lancashire cotton world, and my aunties and uncles worked in mills. When the mills shut down, if they reopened at all, it was with machinery instead of people, but they were horrible jobs. They were dirty and dangerous jobs. And so in the long run, that was probably a good thing. But thinking about how is people's time at work changing is actually a really good lens on the kind of shifts that will come about due to technology. And we don't really collect any time use data on what happens at work. It's a black box. So I think it would be particularly interesting at the moment to launch some time use surveys on how people in different activities, and you might use exposure or you might use expertise as your lens, which ones to pick, how are their jobs changing over time? We are working with a big professional services company and trying to use their Outlook diary data to understand how people's time use is shifting. I'm not sure the data is actually good enough for that to work. So it might be that we need to do some surveys to get it instead, but that would be a fantastic way to understand how work is changing. We also want to know what happens to the level of employment and the wage distribution, so tracking that also. And then there's this question about new business models. Professional services being a great example here, because they charge by the hour. It's the billable hour is the model. And now AI comes along, and rather than billing 8 hours for a junior analyst, your clients know that you can do that in 10 minutes using AI. So what does that do to your model? How do you think about what value are you creating for your customers? They don't really know. It's a business where there's not much churn in the customer base, a lot of repeat business, built on relationships. It's very, social, personal kind of business actually. So thinking of ways to track that kind of business model change from a very explicitly time-based metric. So there's something interesting in thinking about time in that private business context. And then also time used in household production, which I've alluded to already. I'm sure you know the wonderful Hans Rosling video about the washing machine as one of the best inventions of the 20th century because of all the domestic time it saved for women in particular. So maybe AI is already helping us do things. We can book our restaurants faster or our holidays faster using it. The robotics are improving dramatically. We don't yet have these robots, and I'm not sure we want a single dishwasher unloading robot and a separate bed making robot and a separate vacuuming robot. We want something all purpose, and that doesn't exist yet. But it won't be long. And just going back to that pace of technical change, the AI models for domestic robots already exist. The haptics are improving really quickly. The key barrier now is the communications, because you need very rapid inference between your robot and your data center, which will require a lot of innovation in communications. But that's foreseeable. Should we start to measure household productivity? Time use data, some of you will know much more about that than I do. It does exist, not particularly regular, not as fine-grained as we would like, particularly about digital things that are going on. Expanding that would be fantastic. But should we think about household capital as well? Should we think about inequality between households that can afford these and those that can't? Should we think about it in the context of older care and the bill for the ageing population? So there's also work putting sensors in people's homes, so if they don't open the fridge for 2 days, somebody goes out to check that they're okay. Those kinds of models. Although when I said to the engineer who was doing that, who's going to pay for it, he just hadn't thought about that at all. And how to value that household production as well, with the capital needs and this involved in that. So time use is one of the bits of the book that I get onto. The bit I haven't talked about at all is the beyond GDP, measuring natural capital and social capital, as well as conventional forms of capital. Just a final comment, really. A lot of investment is needed for these general purpose technology changes. This illustrates the famous Paul David article about the spread of electricity. Took 50 years. You had to get away from tool mills built around a steam engine to flat factories with an electric dynamo on each piece of equipment. So that's a big private sector cost. There's also the infrastructure cost of the electricity system to go along with that, and the road system changing to match the different patterns of urban to suburban. So a huge amount of infrastructure investment. We are only in the beginnings of the digital infrastructure, and there are lots of policy issues to worry about there, some of which I've listed here. Setting standards to create market scale, which happened in mobile, for instance. Thinking about the identity layer, big political and social issue about how do you identify people online. The data layer, to what extent should data be open or not? How do we think about trade-offs between private value and public value? Questions of legal liability. If Amazon's agent does my shopping for me and it goes wrong, is it my fault, Amazon's fault, or does the agent need a legal identity and insurance? Who knows? So a lot of questions. But without that infrastructure investment, the private returns to investing in AI won't be there, which is another reason for thinking it might be a slow process. So a load of policy implications, and we want to avoid the Victorian world of inequality and poverty, which accompanied the technologies of the Industrial Revolution. We want to get to the sunlit uplands of the green AI digital economy, but everybody benefits from this technology. But huge sets of issues about policy. Not least, previous transitions have been handled very badly. Parts of our country still bear the scars of the fact that we didn't cope with automation in the 1990s. There are issues about generational transfer. The people whose jobs will be affected first are new cohorts going into the labour market. Questions about risk sharing and gain in society, and more broadly, what is the role of the state in this economy? Because digital technologies have a lot of the economic characteristics of public goods. They're non-rival. There are spillover benefits, there are network effects, huge externalities. The way that we think about the economy in policy terms rests on a set of assumptions that are the opposite of the characteristics of the digital technology. So thinking about it in a collective way rather than in an individualized way, I think is one of the challenges for economic policy now. Sorry if I've gone over, but that's me done. Thank you.